Today I want to show you how to create a slam box. This is a little mini slam box that I have created, and it is made by simply slamming a ball of clay into a shape that you desire and then getting texture on the outside and cutting out a lid and hollowing out the form. So I'm going to walk you through that process today. Make sure you begin with a thoroughly wedged ball of clay or block of clay. I have two different sizes here, also two different clay colors. Both are a stoneware clay. You can use either red stoneware, white stoneware, or dark brown stoneware for this process. So I'm going to work with both of these interesting shapes in creating slam boxes. A slam box can be as small or basically as large as you would like. I actually find that the super small slam boxes are actually more challenging than if you work a little bit larger because of having to get inside that itty bitty form to hollow it out can be challenging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my piece of wedged clay and I'm literally just going to slam it on the table surface. That's why we call that a slam box. And I want to create a shape that has multiple sides that I can play around with textures and carving into the surface. So once you have the general shape that you would like, just spend a little bit more time tapping it to get a little bit more clarity in each of the planes. You want to develop nice angles between each plane of the box. So I'm going back and just tapping it a little bit more. If the clay is a little stiff rather than super soft, it's a little bit easier to get into a nice clean shape. So now I have a fun box shape with a lot of different sides. I want to figure out which is going to be the bottom of the form. I think I'm going to do this, have the form sit like this. So now I want to go in with a rib tool, and you may use a yellow rib or a red rib, and you may use it dry and just smooth out and refine that surface of each plane. That rib tool, if you use the flat side and glide it along each plane, you can then develop nice, sharp, clean corners on the form. That's exactly what we're going for. We want nice clarity of line between each plane. That will lead to strong craftsmanship on your form. So I'm going to really take the time to smooth and refine this surface. You can see that there's areas that kind of dip in right there. They're a little bit sloppy. So I'm just going to tap a little bit more, and now I have a nice flat edge. So really take your time to smooth and refine. So I'm going to turn the camera off temporarily to take my time refining the surface, and then I'll turn it back on again once I have a refined surface. Okay, I now have clarity in the angles, and I've started to smooth and refine the surface of each plane. Now I'm going to go back in with a wet rib and do the final smoothing. So just dip your rib tool in water and glide it along the surface. You want to use as little water as possible because you do not want to oversaturate the form. Once I'm done smoothing out this one little plane, I'll show you what a refined plane should look like. So there's no little divots, no little indents. We are starting to get there. There's one little mark right in there I'm working out right now. So now I'm in good shape. I'm ready to go on to the next plane on the form right here. So I'm going to take a wet rib again and smooth and refine that area. So I'm going to jump from plane to plane now with a damp or wet rib tool and get that final refining stage done. Before we go on to texturizing the surface, I want to show you another fun way to shape slam boxes. So I kind of like this irregular shape rather than going always with cubes. I am going to slam this off of the edge of the table, which will give it a lot of dimension and depth for the slam box shape. So I'm going to sit the box shape sideways like this, but now I have a lot of fun sculptural angles that I can play around with. I want to show you an example of that form that is a little further along. This is another very three-dimensional form that I use the edge of the table to really bring a lot of fun depth to the shape. So my absolute favorite slam box shape that I created is definitely this shape. So now I'm finally in that refinement stage. So I have already used the rib tool to really establish some strong planes and angles on the form. So now I'm going to go in with a damp sponge and work to just further refine the surface. So really take the time for the refinement stage. You will be adding texture on this form in some areas, but you need to make sure to refine first, or when you apply the texture, it will look quite sloppy. So this is what the refined area should look like, nice and smooth. This is not yet refined. You can see the difference. So I'm going to take a little bit of time and further refine this. Now I have finished refining my form, and this is how it looks right now. If you're having some issue with the refining and it feels like you're messing it up a little bit more than getting it refined, then that probably means that your clay is a little too tacky. So you can leave it sit out to dry for just a short amount of time, 10, 15 minutes, or even blow a hairdryer on it for a couple of minutes to just stiffen up the surface before you refine. But now I'm ready to play around with texture. There are lots of objects around that you can use to press texture into your form. You may use found objects that you have around your house, or even play around a little bit with the tools that you have. You do not need to texture the whole thing, but I want you to try to at least find 3 planes, in other words, 3 flat areas that you choose to texture. So I'm going to use the back end of the cleanup tool and do a little bit of a feather-like texture into one of the planes. You may also choose to play around with carving away at the surface to create a design. But I do want to see at least 3 of the planes completely texturized or carved. So you can see that I have started that feathering process. So I'm going to complete that plane using the back side of the cleanup tool and just pressing it in. That allows for some very nice feathering to the surface. I'm also going to use the handle of a paintbrush to choose another area to texturize. I am going to texturize this oblong shape on this side by just pressing the handle of the paintbrush in to make a series of dots. Then I'm going to choose another plane, and I'm going to fill this entire plane, by the way. I'll get back to that later. Then I'm going to choose another plane to carve away some lines. So I'm going to use do some reductive work here. I'm going to do nice diagonal lines that direction. In order to make those lines nice and straight, I'm going to use something as a guide. I'm going to be a little creative here and use my paintbrush handle as a guide. So I'm going to angle that camera down for you, and you can use what you have laying around. A ruler, by the way, works too. See how that makes a nice, neat diagonal line using that paintbrush handle as a guide. You want to be very careful that when you're laying that slam box on the side, that it's stiff enough that it's not going to ruin all that refining that you just took time to do. So I'm going to continue to create these diagonal lines on this particular plane. And get a couple more over here. I want to show you what this looks like finished. Remember, when you're working reductively, you do want to make sure you go back in with a sponge and get some refining done. So there's my general lines. So now I want to get back in there with a sponge. Ooh, and get rid of any clay burrs. I have some clay burrs, some sharp edges sticking out on some of these lines. So get those all resolved. Now you're going to go back and forth between using a sponge and a cleanup tool to finish refining that area. So now I have the sponge over the lines. I'm going to go back in and open up a couple of those lines again, get the cleanup tool wet, use that curved side, clean it off here, and get those lines opened up again. So remember, refinement is often about going between tools, from sponge to cleanup tool and back again. And there we go. We have some nice refined lines. Now, do you see how whenever I made the lines, it kind of messed up that angle right in there? So I'm just gonna go back in with a wet rib and sponge and clean up that plane that I want to remain smooth. There we go. So I'm going to finish adding my texture, and then we're going to get to removing the lid. Okay, on my slam box example, I have a lot of different textures as well as some reductive carving on the surface. So now I'm going to get ready to figure out where I want to cut off the lid. I think that this angle would make a really nice grasp for the lid, so I'm going to place the lid a little bit lower. I think I'm going to do it right about here. I want to relate the line that I'm cutting for the lid with the rest of the form. So I think I'm going to start the lid there and kind of angle it down. So I'm going to start with just sketching that onto the surface first. And again, I'm going to use a straight-edged object to help me achieve a relatively straight line. So I think I'm going to cut the lid right about there. I'm going to start with just drawing lines on there. Do not cut right away. Get your lines on there first. Then I'm going to angle it down this way. Then I think I'll angle it up that way. So I'm going to continue to just sketch that line onto the surface first. Then my lid can continue to kind of follow. So I want it to go this way and then across here. So let me show you what that looks like. So now you can see the line that I have drawn where the lid will be cut, and it relates really well with the design. Now, when you're cutting off your lid, this can be a little bit tricky. This blade is not long enough to get the whole way through. So I'm going to start the cut with the cleanup tool, but then I'm going to need to finish the cut with a longer blade. So at home, you could use a kitchen knife, like a paring knife that you can slide in there. What you want to do is try to angle down at a 45-degree angle so that your lid will have a little edge for it to sit into. But if you're really struggling with that, you can just cut it straight across the top, but then you run the risk of your lid sliding off of the form, which would not be good. So I'm going to start with just cutting at a 45-degree angle with the cleanup tool first. This will then become my guideline for a longer knife that will finish the removal of the lid. So now I have used the cleanup tool the whole way around the form. I have a blade like this laying around the studio since I'm not at home. I do not have a kitchen knife, so I'm going to see if I can get this lid cut off using this blade. This is a bit of a time-consuming process. You want to make sure you're doing this when the clay is just a little bit stiffer, still certainly workable. If your form dries out too much, you're not going to be able to remove your lid, so you're going to end up with a solid block of clay. That's bad news. So I'm really taking the time to get that blade in there at about a 45-degree angle to finish the cut. You can feel it loosening up there. There we go. So now I have separated the lid from the form. Now I'm ready to start with the hollowing out process. So I'm going to take a little time to sketch on there the lines that will be my wall thickness. But what you need to be mindful of is this is a very organic form. So you don't want to cut through the wall of the form. If you do accidentally cut through, you can patch it. But that's about the wall thickness that I want. I'm going to do the same thing with the lid. This is way too solid of a lid. I want to be careful in this area. Look how thin that is. So I don't want to hollow out in that area. I want to hollow out here and here, not here. So I'm going to sketch lines where I'm going to hollow. I definitely need to hollow out this shape a bit. A little bit there. Absolutely none here. So I'm going to go back this direction. So this is more or less the shape that I'm hollowing out because look how thin it is here. So now I'm going to take my loop tool, and you're going to use the flat side of your loop tool rather than the circle, and begin slowly carving this clay away. You want to be gentle with your form because you don't want to distort the shape. So I'm going to continue to remove as much clay as I can with my loop tool. So I'm slowly making progress on hollowing out the form. Hollowing out the form is pretty time consuming, and you want to take it slowly. You want to make sure that your clay is a soft leather hard, not sticky. If it distorts when you touch it, it's way too soft to be hollowing out. So I started hollowing out the lid, and look, I got a hole in there, and that will happen where you accidentally pierce through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dip my tool, my cleanup tool, in water, or you can use your cross-hatching tool, your scoring tool, and I'm going to cross-hatch, and I'm going to stick some soft clay in there to fill that hole. It's no big deal. These slam boxes are really forgiving when it comes to that kind of stuff because I can go back and just smooth and refine it with my rib tool. So I'm going to finish that little patch, and you can see how much I've hollowed out. I had to be very mindful of this little angle here, that you want the lid to be nice and light. So I'm going to glide my fingers in there, feel where the thick parts are, and then you can go back in with the curved side or the straight side, reach in and pull out as much material as you can safely remove. You don't want your wall thickness to be any more than 1/4 inch. The more angles you have on your form, the more challenging it will be to hollow out. This form was really challenging to hollow out because I had to be very mindful of all these little angles. But I made a ton of progress. This is feeling very light. So right now, this form is very sloppy in terms of cleaning out the interior, but it's getting there. So I'm going to reach in with that curved side of the tool, hollow out as much clay as I can. It's a little thick over here. So I'm going to pull as much clay out of that form as I can to get it as light as possible. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of taking your time to really hollow out the form. You don't want a very thick wall paperweight. You're trying to create a little box. So again, I hollowed out quite a bit in there to be mindful of this angle. Once I'm done hollowing out the interior, I'm going to refine the interior. So to further refine the inside after you've removed a lot of clay with your loop tool, you want to go in with the curved side of a cleanup tool, and you're going to make short, quick movements in there, light pressure to clean up and level out the edges of the walls. And you can also use that tool to cut away at any thick areas. When I was doing this though, when I was working with this on the lid, I did cut another hole through the lid. So that does happen. Just remember to go back in and cross hatch and slip thoroughly before you reconnect. Don't just jam clay in the hole. It will crack. So you want to make sure that you're dipping your cross hatching tool in water, cross hatching quite deeply, and then dipping a little bit of clay in water and pressing it in, and that will reseal that area. So you want to use the cleanup tool to level out the inside. That is our first step of refining the interior. So I have done that with both the lid and the jar form. So now I am ready to get in there with a sponge and really smooth. You want to make sure that you are not getting your slam box too wet, or that you're working with it when it's too soft. If you're working with it when it's too soft, you will know, because you will easily distort it as you're holding it. If you're noticing some distortions where you're damaging the texture on the outside or the shape is changing really easily, that means it needs to stiffen a little bit. You may use a hair dryer for a couple minutes to stiffen it, or just leave it sit out for maybe like 10 minutes max, and that will help to stiffen. So I have a damp sponge, and it is just damp, not dripping wet, and I'm going to smooth the edge where the lid and the jar connect. You want to make sure that you do not distort that ledge, that you're just doing a little bit of smoothing. You don't want to distort the shape, or the lid will no longer fit, and that would be a real downer. So now I'm going to get on that inside, and this is the part that takes time. I know that refining can be a real test of patience, but it makes a real difference in the final work of art. When we're talking about the craftsmanship aspect of your grade, I'm referring to that refinement stage. So please take your time to refine the interior. That is a big part of your craftsmanship grade. So this is already looking a lot better. I still have a bit more cleanup to do deep down, but you can already see it's getting a lot smoother, making sure I didn't pierce through anywhere. You can also use your finger to refine the areas that you can't reach with the sponge. It's easy but time consuming. So make sure that you're fully refining both the bottom and the top of the form. I'm going to take a little bit of time, especially with the deeper areas of this form, and then I'm going to work on refining the lid. So I'm just finishing up refining the lid. I want to emphasize that refinement is a lot of back and forth movement to really get that clay to have a nice smooth surface. So I now have a refined interior. So let's see how much distortion happened through this process. It's not too bad. It actually fits pretty well. I'm gonna spend a little bit of time refining this very edge right along here. I can see that there's still a little bit of sharp clay, or we refer to them as clay burrs, on the edges of the form. So I'm going to be very gentle in refining that using my finger as well as the cleanup tool. A little bit more water on there, back and forth, to get those edges where that transition takes place nice and refined. So once you are finished with your slam box, I recommend taking a tissue and placing a tissue between the lid and the jar when you set it out to stiffen. The reason for that is it will prevent, since this is going to be a bit sticky because it's wet, it will prevent the top and bottom from sticking together and needing to be pried apart. When you need to pry it apart later, it can mess up the edge a little bit. So I want to remind you that when you're transporting this into school, if you're working from home, you want to make sure you're bringing it in a leather hard state, wrapped carefully, and not in your backpack. So enjoy the pinch or the slam pot process, and in the end you will have a fun lidded jar. And do not forget to sign the bottom. First initial, full last name.